Hey, before we start this podcast, I want to let you know that Kaki is sponsoring this video. Now, if you don't know what Kaki is a fantastic website where you can buy Thomas products that won't get you price gouged out of your mind. It's really good. I like it a lot. They have some really cheap items. And when I say cheap, I don't mean like, oh, it's poor quality. I mean like price-wise, French kiss. It is so good. They got everything from Play Rail to Erdl, Take Along, Wooden Railway. Now the cheap prices are great, but if you want to save even more money, you can use code PDP10 to save an extra 10% off your first order. And the money that you save using the code goes to supporting me as a creator, so thank you very much if you do that. Even if you don't want to use the code though, it is a fantastic website and I definitely recommend. Anyways, that's all I gotta say. Thank you Kaki for sponsoring the show. Link in the description. Now, on to the main event. Hello and welcome to the Analyzation Express, the show where I read and review a variety of Thomas content that I wouldn't be able to tackle in my normal videos. I'm here for part 2 of Thomas and the Great War, the best war. No other wars have topped it. We're going into chapter 4 now. If you saw part 1, you already know what I thought about those first 3 chapters. I don't really want to repeat myself too much, although I'm sure I will as the story goes on. Heading into chapter 4 now, welcome to Sodor / Thomas and Friends. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Christopher woke up to hear a ship hooting and clanging its horn in the distance. Clanging its horn in the distance? Honking its horn might be the better word there. The boy felt as though he were about to be rammed, had the ship been a 4-funnel ocean liner with a 200-ton superstructure. Huh? All he could hear next was a foghorn and a lighthouse shining its beam into the early morning. He heard the lighthouse beam, relieved he had finally found dry land. Christopher was even more relieved that he had not landed on a deserted island, for the next thing he saw was a little harbor with a small cargo ship. So using the oar, he pushed the boat further next to the barge named Dignity that was stationed on the concrete quay. Sliding off of the front of Dignity, Christopher, after having some difficulty getting to his feet, picked up his sack and swung his right foot onto the quay, wobbling a bit as he took a few steps on the new land he had discovered, unless someone else had found it first. What the heck? The story is like, as the person writing it was typing away, they were like, oh, I want to add a new thing. It's like they were making revisions as they were typing it, but they weren't like deleting stuff. There were a few men dressed in working clothes like the dockyard crew at Southampton, about to return home after taking the night shift, as well as a pair of railway tracks, railway tracks, and a pair of buffers with 3 coal trucks parked in front of it. You see what I mean here? The few workmen and the railroad tracks, everything from that, those have to be 2 sentences. You can't just keep adding stuff onto it. A few feet away from the track was a depot, possibly the harbor station for passengers traveling by ship. Still feeling wobbly, Christopher, who should be really fucking glad that he isn't dead by now, walked slowly to the platform, rested his back against the brick facade, that's not what facade means, and clutched his sack, going back to sleep while waiting for a train, as if he could just get on a train. In this way, he could tell the crew where he was. That's just wrong. I suppose I shall have to ask for the name of the country since I've gone up north, the boy thought, and so he rehearsed his question before he let the drowsiness of sleep take over him. Please, sir, is this Ireland or Scotland? Later, when the sun had fully gone up to its highest, nobody in the harbor noticed Christopher sleeping on the platform, except for a sharp-eyed tank engine painted blue with red stripes and the number 1 on its side tags. Gee, I wonder who it could be. It had 6 small wheels, a short stumpy funnel, a short stumpy boiler, and a short stumpy dome, with a golden yellow whistle in between the cab windows, which were circular. The tank engine was pulling 2 bogie coaches with the names Annie and Clarabelle written in white on their sides, followed by 7 trucks of stone and a brake van in the back. As the tank engine pulled into the station, he noticed Christopher sleeping against the wall, something we've already established, but he established it again, which made him curious. His railway had very few visitors and had a populace of people who were born in England ever since the days of man and animal. What? The engine wasn't sure if he wanted to wake up the boy, but still feeling curious, he blew his 3-chime whistle and Christopher's eyes shot open with a startling gasp. Blinking his eyes, Christopher saw that the answer had come to him in the form of a tank engine with a friendly smile on a gray face where a smokebox door would be. Never in all his life had he seen an engine with a face, especially one that fluctuated in an expression like a regular human face. Huh? So never before had he seen an engine with a face, especially, what other kind of face would it be? A animal face? Cliff face? What kind of other face could it possibly be? He was more than a little surprised when he found out that the engine could talk as well. "Hello," greeted the engine in a cheeky voice. "I must be dreaming," Christopher said, quietly, no commas. "I didn't know trains could speak," but the engine had heard his every word, probably because Christopher said it out loud within earshot. "Well, no one really has," admitted the engine. "But just to be more formal with the introductions. My name is Thomas. What might yours be? I can promise you from the bottom of my heart that Thomas would never speak like this." Christopher was just dizzy. "Things do seem to have gotten a little bumpy on the boat ride," he said, and quickly fainted. The tank engine named Thomas looked down at Christopher and saw the boat he arrived at. Christopher brought the boat with him? What? It was not secured to the quay. Bro, where is this man in relation to the station? It was not secured to the quay, and he found its castaway of a passenger to be something of an interest for the first time in almost 28 years. What? "Driver, carry the boy into my cab, and fireman, could you have that boat secured to the quay? I'm sure the harbor master could find some usefulness out of it." So Thomas's crew obeyed. Jeez. And after delivering the stone needed for the barge to be taken to the mainland, he puffed away to the shed. Who puffed away? Thomas, I assume, puffed away to the shed at the nearest end of the line, known to its inhabitants as Tidmouth, where the other engines who worked the main line were resting. At the yard, Thomas left the coaches and trucks in the goods shed. Just you guys can stay with the riffraff. And went off to find someone to notify his fellow engines about his recent discovery. The station ahead of the yard had 4 terminal lines and platforms sheltered by a glass roof and an extra line of track that headed past the station to the local dockyards and a branch line going north. I've already forgotten what we're talking about. The sheds in front of the station had a turntable located to the left side on a separate track and had 6 rails leading into it. Today, Thomas had been looking for one of his closer friends, a smart little green saddle tank engine with 4 wheels named Percy, who had been bought by the railway when the big engines went on a labor strike. Because they were both tank engines, they'd always shared in each other's thoughts and secrets and liked to play with trucks in the yard and games like hide and peep or just helping each other out. Okay, so this is clearly hit era Thomas we're talking about here. After a quick search, Thomas found his friend pushing a van into the front of a goods train. "Morning, Thomas," Percy greeted. "Back from branch line duties." "I'm not exactly taking the day off, Percy," Thomas answered. He wasn't saying that you were. "I just wanted to let you know about my discovery of a young castaway I found at the harbor." "Oh?" asked Percy while going off the subject. "It does seem nice to get a little time to yourself. Did you say castaway?" "What?" "I'll explain in the shed," said Thomas, and he and Percy puffed into the sheds where they lived with 7 other engines. Didn't you say there were 6 lines going into the shed? They all had tenders and were much bigger than Thomas and Percy. They were just ready to start the day off with a puff and a whistle before the tank engines barged in front of them. "I hope you're not here just to waste our time with unimportant things," said a big blue engine named Gordon. "We big engines have a reputation to keep up." "I had 5 vans brought in last night," added a big green engine whose name was Henry. "And after that stressful night, 5 whole vans, whoa. My own driver and fireman would not even listen to you." Edward, the blue engine, looking careworn as showing his age and appearance, yawned. "I am getting too old for this." 2 red engines named James and Eagle, who were already up and about. "Is it time to show my new coat of paint yet?" asked James in a curious tone. "Not yet," Eagle said next to him. Okay, now I said in a previous story that I looked at that having lines in between new characters talking is important. And the criticism I had with that story is that they would have too many line breaks where they didn't need them to be. Here, it's pretty much the opposite, where Eagle, after he talks, there's no line break between James asking the question and Eagle speaking, which is a small thing, I'm aware, but it is something that I do look for. 2 more blue engines, one a B-12, I think I need a shot of B-12, numbered 98462, the other a B-17 numbered 87546 from the LNER, blew their whistles in a commanding tone. "Let's hear what they have to say," cried 98462, "and it better be quick before the fat director finds out," put in 87546. "To be fair, I think if I'm following this correctly, these are the loaned engines. I don't know why one of them's named Eagle. I don't know where they're pulling Eagle from, but okay. I think these are the loaned engines from like the first books of the Railway series. Anyway, Thomas's driver and fireman lifted the still unconscious Christopher out of the cab and onto a hammock near Thomas's side of the shed. Where'd they get the hammock? Located on the right-hand side wall of the interior. The engines were curious and slightly interested when Thomas told them he was a castaway. "This boy might be our answer," said nobody. Someone's saying that, but it doesn't say who. "By evacuating children?" asked Percy innocently. "Where do you think he even came from?" Thomas asked him. He asked Percy, I guess. "We might be able to help the war effort with his knowledge of the outside world." "A real foreigner?" 87546 dumbly stated, because he's dumb. "Where do you suppose he came from?" "Well, isn't it obvious?" said 98462, using his intelligence, no commas at all. "This child is from the mainland. How would you figure that shit out? If we're lucky, he might be able to put this island on the map." "Do you think he will?" someone asked, but the author didn't say who. "Absolutely," someone else said. Might be 98462, but I'm not sure. A moaning sound filled the room. Christopher was waking up, twisting his head back and forth. "Mom?" He opened his eyes further to see he was in the presence of 8 more steam engines with faces on their smokebox doors. Christopher jumped from the hammock and backed against the wall, frightened by the strange and wonderful discovery of the engines who could speak his language. "Where am I?" asked Christopher when he looked at his new surroundings. "Well," began Thomas, "this is an engine shed, and we're the engines." "I can see that," said Christopher. "Where exactly am I?" "You're in Tidmouth," exclaimed Thomas. "Thomas, I swear, I'm gonna frickin' smack you if you give another stupid answer like that again." "The main terminus on the island of Sodor." The main terminus? There can only be one terminus. "Sodor?" Christopher was confused. "Well, I beg your pardon, but I've never heard of such a place before." "None of the maps do," explained Edward. "None of the maps do. None of the maps do." Then along came Sir Topham Hatt, the man in charge of all the engines on Sodor. They called him the Fat Director due to his appearance and because they're assholes. He was a stout man with a top hat, a black coat, a yellow vest, and gray trousers with black shoes. This is something that I've seen not particularly in Thomas stories, but in other stories where they feel they need to say exactly what the person is wearing. Like, I'm just going to picture them being completely nude if they don't. Like, I don't understand what the fascination is with being like, and he has blue jeans and black shoes and red socks, and he's wearing his patented Sodor branded thong. Like, I don't need this information. "Why are you still here?" he boomed. "Thomas found a castaway," peeped Percy. The Fat Controller looked at Christopher and studied his face. He could tell that he was an evacuating Londoner by the clothes and luggage sack. "Those are some Sherlock Holmes level deduction skills, my guy." "I seemed to like the looks of this one. His eyes are straight and he is indeed an evacuee," said the Fat Director. "What's your name, son?" "Christopher Audrey." Hearing his last name rung some distant bells into Edward's memory. "That name sounds familiar," he said. "Who wants to know?" mumbled Chris. "I knew a boy named Audrey who came here during the previous war," admitted Edward. I feel like we're having 2 completely different conversations here. "If I could only remember his first name, then I would be certain that the 2 of you were related." What, you already said that it was some Audrey boy, so wouldn't that strong proof? I mean, I'm not saying that people with the last name are guaranteed related, but the logic here is a little strange. Christopher did not wish to bring up the subject of his father, even though it could literally, like, you know, get him back home and away from this strange place with talking steam engines. So he pushed the thought aside and thought about how he was going to live in this strange new world of talking trains and solitude. "Well, there's no use putting me in a boys' home," Christopher said to the Fat Director. "I still have my parents back home in London, at least my mom. Dad's enlisted." "You poor child," sympathized Henry. "You must be feeling sorry for yourself." "That's very kind of you, Henry," the Fat Director added. but however long the war goes, he stays until his parents can be located. So I want you to make him feel welcome and comfortable. He'll just live in the sheds. That's fine. We accept, sir, said the engines, completely fine with a child literally taking refuge in their sheds. And the fat controller left to his car and drove off to the station office while the other engines went off to work. Thomas, on the other hand, spoke to Christopher. Christopher, our railway, whilst connected to the mainland railways, is not very well known, and Sodor, as Edward mentioned before, is not on a lot of maps of the world. And if we can't help provide a major effort with the war, we're useless. What about all the people who live on the island, though? Wait a minute. Surely the British government must know that the island of Sodor exists. It has to. It's the only place on Earth, allegedly, with talking steam engines. You can't tell me that they're just sitting on resources and not using them. You've got your own railway, scoffed Christopher. Isn't that enough? What part of being really useful do you not understand? Snapped Thomas. That's your affair, not mine. Christopher has a very good vocabulary despite literally being a child. Christopher often wished he could be a steam engine many times before, but now was not really any time for silly dreams. Bro, you're in a magical land of talking steam engines. I say sky's the limit at this point. It's not so hard for one engine to make a difference, Thomas argued. But this is about all of us as friends and family. I'm really pushing the virtues here. Family? Christopher seemed puzzled, reminding him of his own family, which was small and only consisted of him and his parents. What about extended family? Cousins, grandpa, grandma, that kind of stuff. All three seemed very different and drifted apart from one another, directly on the verge of becoming a broken family. Dude, your mom and dad have been nothing but apologetic and supportive from what I've seen. I mean, we haven't seen a whole lot of them, but like, they weren't like neglectful to you. I think you're just a dick. If you like to call it that way, Thomas blushed. What? Christopher was starting to put two and two together. He had felt selfish in his life and was not willing to risk his own life for the wants and needs of others just to be on the safe side. That's not a sentence. So let me get things straight. You want to get every engine on this island to fight for England, all because you think that this railway is non-existent to the mainland? Yes, indeed, I guess, said Thomas. Has it occurred to you that it may be a private railway? That could be a good explanation. Dude, we're in the 40s right now. There's no, like, Sodor is not a heritage railway. I don't think it becomes a heritage railway until, like, the 70s. To tell you the truth, Thomas confessed, business hasn't been going well since the Great Depression that started in America. Christopher had to disagree. Where there's a will, there's a way, he said, and threw his body onto the hammock, deciding to spend the rest of his day sleeping to overcome this delusion of talking engines. You mean delusion? Thomas was starting to have a sinking feeling about Christopher, but his branch line service came first. So he went back to the goods shed to collect Annie and Clarabelle and headed for Knapford Junction, hoping that the day of Sodor's reckoning would come, especially since they were on the verge of newly invested diesel engines who did not run on coal or water, but a far more pollutant substance called oil. Thomas, I hate to break it to you, but running on coal, also not good for the environment. I'm just saying. I know it's great for you because, you know, you live off the stuff, but for the rest of the world, kind of putting a dent in the ozone layer. Okay, moving on to Chapter 5, Life on Sodor. Elsewhere on the other side of the island, at the terminal station of Vickerstown, a D37 on loan from the LMS had been invited to serve the Northwestern Railway by Sir Topham Hatt for a trial run. The diesel engine, simply named Diesel, was a devious individual who hated steam engines ever since the day he was built. What an asshole. They are nothing but a pile of scrap. Ancient, outdated, and an object of the past, he explained to his driver. Because he ran on oil, Diesel did not need a fireman. Yeah, instead he operated on controls that were far more advanced than steam engines. The type of controls that were operated on wires and fan motors. With the Nazi incorporate papers in my cab, courtesy of the Führer's spies, Diesel said to his driver, I can introduce their ways to this island, and it should give the Fatherland an opportunity to take England by force. Diesel, what the fuck are you doing? What if they don't comply, asks his driver to the Nazi Diesel. Then we will force them, said Diesel, like this. And he pushed a sleeping truck through a pair of unsafe buffers. The truck's body and wheels broke away from each other as they slid all over the concrete and into a brick wall. Holy shit. I always think of trucks as nothing more than a thing to play with, Diesel grinned. This is getting a little fucked. At the Strensall camp, home of the KRRC, and in parentheses, King's Royal Rifle Corps. You could have just written King's Royal Rifle Corps, you didn't have to do that. Where several troops were stationed, Wilbert was in a tent chattering with the other soldiers when a messenger boy on a bicycle came to him with an envelope in his hand. It was a letter from Margaret, so Wilbert opened it up and read it to himself, ignoring all the other men rambling on the local gossip. My dearest Wilbert, last night I had been very worried about you, and so was Christopher. He has been such a wonderful boy while you were still here, but the war has destroyed him as much as it did to London 2 years ago, and without you, he can never be happy. And I couldn't be bothered to just talk to my son like a responsible parent. But one day, if I were to die from all these attacks, should the enemy return, you are the only one who can look after our son. Until then, protect him as much as you would protect your own men. Love, Margaret. She literally said, hey, your son is sad because you're not here, which you already know. And if I die, you'll be the only one to take care of him, which, again, you already know. Wilbert looked at the letter for a while and looked outside to the nearest window he could find, gazing out at the somber sky. I know how you feel, Christopher, he whispered to no one in particular. But you have to understand that, I can't always be here for you. Wilbert turned back to his friends. None of them, fortunately, had heard a word. Hermann Göring, a leader member of the Nazi Party and commander-in-chief of the German Air Force, or Luftwaffe in parentheses, was at Berlin's Staaken aircraft. What the fudge? How did we get to Berlin? He was at the airfield, unfolding a map with Chancellor Adolf Hitler is also there. General Hans, unpronounceable, and Flying Ace, also unpronounceable, on the table near the main hangar area. They were planning an alternative to make the United Kingdom surrender by attacking the British islands, and Sodor was one of them. Didn't they just say that Sodor wasn't on a lot of maps? How did the Nazis have a map? Our reconnaissance reports show that the British Isles would make an easier target to attack since there appear to be no signs of military enforcement. Why there are no military enforcement? You'd think there would be a military base on Sodor somewhere. I know we never see one in the books, but come on. Göring said to his comrades in German, just as I always thought there would be a little hope for the English. Why not that island? Asked General unpronounceable. He pointed to the Isle of Man and Sodor on the map with a caliper. Caliper? An instrument measuring external or internal dimensions, having two hind legs in the air that resemble a compass, and in turn, and just say a ruler or his finger. It seems compatible with our standards. In other words, an easy target. Why would they bother bombing parts of Britain that are not, if they don't have an army base, then why would you even bother with them? Like, I feel like at this point in the war, you should have other things to be focusing on, guys. I hate to say it, but your campaign on Russia isn't going to go as well as you think it will. It seems compatible with our standards. In other words, an easy target, agreed Lutzow. Hitler looked carefully at the map. He did not know which island they were referring to. And which island might this be? He asked in perfect American English. Göring pointed to Sodor with both of his index fingers. The large one, my leader, but it's probably nothing. Then what's the point? If you don't suspect that there's anything there, then why would you bother with it? Are you contradicting your own thoughts? Hitler crossed his arms and gave a severe look to Göring. Yeah, I think he is. No, answered Göring. I just think it might be difficult. But once we find the island and attack it the same way our Japanese allies attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, there is a possible chance that a part of Britain will surrender to us before the rest of the United Kingdom follows. Huh? What's the point of it? You just said, I don't think there's a military base, but it looks like it's gonna be difficult, but maybe there's nothing there. And if we attack this place with nothing there, then the United Kingdom will just fold and be like, aight, you win, boys. The dictator smiled. He would finally have the British under his thumb. You just said you thought there was nothing there. If not, he would be stuck in a war without an ending. Now, Sodor did not just have a standard gauge railway, no page breaks or anything like that at all. At least put in like a second line so that you can say that it's a scene change. Jeez. Now, Sodor did not just have a standard gauge railway with only a main line and 5 branches. There were also 3 other railways, a rack railway known as the Culdee Fell Railway, and 2 narrow gauge lines, the Mid-Sodor and Skarloey Railways. On the MSR, 10 engines, holy shit. On the MSR lived 10 engines on the western side of the island. You could just said on the MSR, like, Duke, Stuart, Falcon, Albert, who? Atlas. From Stories of Sodor, the thing that won't exist until like a couple years from now. Jim, who? Tim, huh? And Jerry. Jerry Seinfeld is also there. 2 other engines named Stanley and Smudger were cocky Americans who often came off the rails for their reckless fashion, and as a result, were given an unfortunate fate. Stanley became a pumping engine for the mines, while Smudger became a generator for the engine shed. Both of them knew they would never move again, but they longed for it. To never move again? Okay. You gotta also love that the author is like, do I use Stanley from the Railway series or Smudger from the TV series? Fuck it, just use both of them. As for the active engines, Duke was number 1 and the oldest of the locomotives, named after his grace, Sir Robert Charles Norramby, the Duke of Sodor. He was called Grandpuff by Stuart and Falcon because they looked up to him as a grandfather figure who exploited his knowledge to the young ones. Exploited his knowledge? What? But nonetheless, Falcon and Stuart got very tired of hearing about his grace and would tease Duke about going on forever while other engines came and went. However, after hearing Duke's story about Stanley and Smudger, Stuart and Falcon became more useful, and all 3 of them, including the other 5 engines, lived happily over the next few years working the railway. Oh my gosh, can I please have some real character interaction? Today, Stuart and Falcon were shunting trucks for the mines in the hills of Peel Godred. They had been working for almost 8 hours and longed to see something more eventful, like the war going on outside their island. But, as Duke said about the war, through his catchphrase, that would never suit his grace, and they were still trying to learn more so that they too could one day be as wise as old Grandpuff. Grandpuff taught us well since the story of number 2, Stuart remorsed. It's like there has been a change in us. Well, maybe he wants us to know better before his age catches up to us, replied Falcon. Huh? Then he remembered something else. Does your driver's wife make necklaces? She makes bracelets, said Stuart. I hear they can be used to make friendships a lot longer from a human point of view. You mean what they think? Falcon was doubtful. Stuart just laughed. Only Grandpuff would think that. After 3/4 of a minute, so 45 seconds, Stuart was finished with his work and let Albert take over his shift with Falcon. Wait, over 45 seconds, Stuart finished his work. Duke was there congratulating Stuart for his hard work. Well done, Stuart, Duke said. I'm sure the manager will give you a promotion on the mountain road. Further south of Tidmouth, the mainline engine, oh my gosh, we're back to the mainline engine, were preparing for the arrival of Diesel, with all the spare work that had to be done by the end of the day. Huh? Eagle and James had already finished their jobs and were now resting in the shed with Gordon, Thomas, and Christopher by their side. A Diesel who's not even red and we're all treating him like a king, complained James. You're just jealous, replied Eagle. James was always receiving a comfortable sort of words from his only brother long before he came to Sodor. It was during the days as a goods engine on the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway when he was painted black and had wooden brake blocks like all the other engines built by George Hughes. That was a history lesson that, again, I don't understand why you put that in there instead of actual character interaction, but whatever. He was now painted in a new coat of red and had been very vain about it ever since Thomas helped him out of an accident that earns the Blue Tank engine his own branch line. Feeling comforted by Eagle's words. Why would he feel comforted by Eagle's words if Eagle said here just yell? Like, that sounds like he's teasing him. Feeling comforted by Eagle's words, James decided to change the subject. Thomas, he said, about the boy, my name is Christopher. Christopher, shouldn't we do something about his innocence? What do you mean? Asked Thomas. For once, explained Gordon, James does have a point. You see, young Christopher is still too young to understand the horrors and violent acts that go on in a war like the one we are facing now. Christopher was offended. I understand what war can do to you. He looked down at himself in regret. I think. Well, that just goes to show you, young man, that I am a big blue engine who knows everything, finished Gordon. Don't listen to him, Thomas said to Christopher. He's not making sense to begin with, so fair play on Thomas's part. I think he's a very bossy blue boiler. I heard that, wheezed Gordon, and he puffed away to look for some more engines in need of his help, in quotes. He found Henry, 98462, 87546, Edward, and Percy at the harbor discussing the new arrival. Hey, don't you guys have trains that need to be run? I think the new diesel is bound to be a show-off, said Edward. Edward's right, agreed Henry. Since diesel engines were recently invented 10 years ago on the mainland and in America, this one is bound to prove that he is more advanced than the rest of us. How conceited, said 98462. How selfish, put in 87546. Then we should treat him like a king, whistled Percy. Or better yet, added Gordon, just plainly ignore him and let the newcomer take his course. You mean we should just let him leave? Asked Percy. Yes, Percy. It's for the sake of our preservation. In his office, the fat controller and his wife Jane were thinking about taking a holiday in the southern region of England, since it was a safe haven from all the German bombings, aside to the countryside where its children were evacuated to during the Blitz. This is like the same logic that people were using in the pandemic when they're like, oh, the case numbers are down, it's okay to not wear masks anymore, and then the case numbers shot all the way back up. What could the engines do without you? Asked his wife. She was having an afterthought. We can have my son Charles look after them, or perhaps that new diesel engine I sent over from the LMS, said the fat controller. I'm sure he knows how to be responsible, reliable, and really useful, because my engines are to be looking forward to a good night's sleep tonight. What? Tomorrow is going to be a very hot day. In fact, a very nice day to go to the beach. He chuckled before he sat down in his chair and wiped his brow. That night, the engines were all resting in the shed. Christopher was asleep, barefoot and bare-chested on the hammock with his blazer and a woolly blanket to keep him warm. As soon as the light from the fat director's office went out, Thomas spoke to the other engines. Think, everyone, what better way for us to help the war? We haven't tried taking soldiers to the mainland, said Henry. That might work, agreed Percy. Yeah, just round up a bunch of people and just take them to the mainland. Oh, you don't even have to tell them that they're fighting in the war. Thomas looked over at the sleeping Christopher and saw the sadness underneath his sleepy expression. He had to make the boy feel happy again, with or without his parents. What about Christopher? Thomas whispered, so as not to wake him up. There are plenty of children all around the world who have lost their parents because of this war. Well, maybe they wouldn't be orphaned if their parents chose not to fight, remarked Gordon, being the heartless bastard that he is. Besides, they still have grandmothers, grandfathers, aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews. Nieces and nephews cannot take care of orphans. So being lazy all your life and getting bombed, smothered, and shot by the enemy is good enough for you? Replied Thomas sarcastically. What the fuck are you saying, Thomas? You didn't say that at all. The engines thought about it for a moment, then Percy whistled. It's still a living. Filled with confidence, Thomas spoke first, even though everyone else has been speaking. Do you know what the problem is? The boundaries aren't just on the maps. They're up here in your funnels. Out there is an open world that none of us have been to in a long time. A world that is just beyond the Vickerstown Bridge, with wide open spaces and a different language spoken by the populace that we can connect to. In short, different places, different scenery, and different people. Thomas, what point are you trying to make here? Who would look after us? Asked Edward. We'll look after ourselves. Thin logic, considering that you're a steam train and therefore have no rights. And where's the manager? Asked James and Eagle together. There is no manager, said nobody. I assume it's Thomas speaking, but it doesn't specify. And where does the controller live? Peeped Percy. Is he on a holiday? There is no controller who lives anywhere but the line he runs, laughed Thomas. And somewhere along the way, we can meet new engines, new coaches, and new trucks. That's not how a railway is run, Thomas, you dipshit. The engines began to reflect on their own lives before they came to Sodor. 98462 and 87546 just laughed rudely at Thomas. "What a load of tripe," chuckled 87546, being the most relatable character in this scene so far. 98462 was the rudest of the two, and spoke to Thomas in a presumptuous manner. "Why don't you just face the facts, little Thomas? The chances of us being moved to a larger railway is futile. I mean, we're all happy here, aren't we?" Thomas admitted defeat. "I suppose you're right," he said sadly, "but at least a little visit to the mainland wouldn't hurt a bit." A while later, the other engines fell asleep except for Christopher. Christopher was already asleep. What? After hearing the latter part of their conversation, he decided to take a walk outside the shed and let the cold night air over his exposed body, not caring about his shoes or his shirt. Bro, haven't you heard? No shirt, no shoes, no service, man. You're gonna get kicked out unless you cover up. The door to the shed was halfway open, so he let himself out and took a deep catch of the current temperature, gazing out into the starry sky and clearing his head from unpleasant things like the war and his father. But when the face of Wilbert came into his mind, even though he was trying to clear it from his mind, Christopher buried his face into his hands and started to cry, falling to his knees as the tears came out of his eyes. Discouraged, Christopher walked back into the safety of the shed and cuddled himself up onto the hammock, still spilling a few tears as he cried himself to sleep and whispered in a somber voice of loneliness, "I miss you, Daddy." Okay, that was chapter 5. I think we're gonna just call things here. What do I think about this story? Honestly, I like the concept of it, like I said last time, but this story is faltering in a major way for me. This doesn't feel like me reading a story out of a book. This feels like that someone is sitting down for me after we've had like some coffee or something, and he's telling me the story, and he keeps going off on tangents about the LMS, and there's a D37 on loan. And this story, I'm sorry, after 5 chapters, isn't really doing it for me. Now, despite that, I know that this story does have some fans. I've been seeing in the comments of the story that a lot of people actually do quite like it, and that's perfectly fine. I'm not saying that they're wrong. I'm just saying that this style of writing doesn't really work for me personally. If you want to take a look at the story for yourself, I'll have the link in the description to the story so you can have a look. Honestly, I wouldn't say this is a great story. It's got an interesting premise. It's got 20 chapters. It's a big story. It's just not a very interesting one, I would say, which is a shame because World War II on Sodor is a really fun idea. And the sad thing is, I think I've only seen one actual story tackle this concept in a genuinely entertaining way, and that's the Stories of War. And while I'd love to go on about how great that story is, that is a project for another day. As for this one, I definitely hope the person that wrote this continues writing, continues improving themselves, takes my criticism into consideration, tries to make things feel more like the characters are interacting instead of just someone summarizing the story for us. And maybe I'll check out some more of their work in the future. But until then, I want to say thank you for watching, thank you to Kaki for sponsoring this video, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.